On our 50th wedding anniversary, I found the child my wife adopted was her illegitimate child. When I learned the truth, I had a heart attack and died on the spot. Luckily, God gave me another chance to be reborn, so I could take revenge on the shameless couple. Ding! Story Shots reminds you to click the subscribe button at the bottom right corner to read the full novel. I still remember. It was our 50th wedding anniversary. I was happy to have spent half a century with the woman I loved. I was proud of those golden years that passed in her company. This wonderful day also brought me the biggest sorrow and loss of my life. It was our golden wedding anniversary, also the day when my wife passed away. Passing through the lanes of memory, when we were young, my entrepreneurial and business ventures were slow but building up, but they caused my wife excessive exhaustion. This exhaustion cost my wife 2 spontaneous miscarriages, after which she was physically damaged and was unable to conceive again. I, the father of those unborn children, was deep in sorrow and remorse. As much as I wanted to have children and be a father, my wife's health was more important. Thus, I took it upon myself to assure her that I didn't need any children in this lifetime. To fill the gap, she adopted a child. When the company started to climb up, it was my initiative to resign and switch to a full-time house husband, taking care of our adopted child like my own. During all this time, I was very happy and felt content with the flow of life. However, it was not until my wife died that I discovered the miscarriages she claimed accidental were actually induced abortions. It broke my heart, unable to understand her decision to kill my babies and adopt an orphan unrelated to us. There were many more things than this that I discovered after her death, one after another. Believe me, each one of them brought me shocks and left me numb in the end. Let me tell you all that I discovered. During the process of applying to study abroad 40 years ago, my wife gave birth to a son for her first love. Later, that child became my adopted son, John Smith, whom I raised for 40 long years. When the truth was uncovered, I had a massive heart attack and died on the spot. But what is the matter? How come I feel like waking up from a night's sleep? Why does it feel strange? The moment I opened my eyes again, I was back to the day when my wife brought John home. I clearly remember that day. My wife brought a little boy home. When they saw me, she asked him to call me Dad. John, call him Dad. This is your home from now on. She introduced him to me. My wife, Betty Smith, led 5-year-old John into the door and asked him to call me Dad as soon as she saw me. I looked at the youthful and beautiful appearance of my wife. I was so confused she died before me. Why was she so young? Took a while for my mind to get a hold of what was happening. Was I born again? Is it rebirth? I was still analyzing the facts about the past life and the new life when Betty called me. Seeing me in a daze, Betty thought I was hesitating to accept John. Her face turned cold. What's with that expression, Ben Carlson? You don't want me to adopt a child. Do you still remember how and why I lost my babies? You just disgusted that I am not being able to bear children for you? Do you think an adopted child is inferior to a biological one? Have you forgotten that I had 2 miscarriages for your sake? I looked at her mouth, opening and closing so rhythmically. I let her finish and then lightly said, "You went abroad for studies 5 years ago. If I am not mistaken, you got pregnant at that time and gave birth to a child there." Pointing at the little boy, I said, "The child should be 4 or 5 years old now, right?" Betty licked her lips nervously, but still held her ground. "You see, everything is dirty. Why did I go abroad? That was just to earn money for you. Do you think everyone is like you, who just sits idly doing nothing? If that's what you think, then let's just divorce." I responded with a smile. "Betty, I'm not sure if my heart is dirty, but I know for sure that you are." Seeing us arguing, John cried out in fear. Paying no attention to the mother-son pair, I dragged a chair to sit and calmly watch the drama unfold. In my past life, I had no idea about these things and never realized how amazing were Betty's persuasive abilities. Back then, when Betty brought back John, I accepted him as my son without any hesitation and raised him, taking great care of him for decades. It was all because I loved Betty that I was willing to accept whatever she did, unconditionally. After returning from her studies, She started regularly volunteering at orphanages, contributing both time and money. I thought she was coping with her inability to have children and was giving her affection to the orphans. It looked so impressive, leading me to care for her more and more. Never in my mind had I imagined that all the care, concern, affection, and spending money all had a purpose. Who would have thought that the intention of her good deeds was fake? Everything she did was just so that she could rightfully see John. What's more ridiculous, I often praised that they had the same pair of eyes, just like real mother and son. Even said to be fated. I missed her unsettled look when I mentioned it back then. Betty laughed it off awkwardly, making me feel that she was embarrassed due to my comment, making me feel guilty in turn. Thinking about it now, all these were signs. I was so blind. My dedication to John did not result in any good. Instead, it caused me early death. It was John who, after the death of Betty, brought his real father, Paul Zander, over to confront me. It was at that time John revealed all the truth. He not only gave me a jolt, I had to give up the ashes of my wife Betty. Then he demanded to hand over the company to him. The father and son duo sang in a chorus. All the sudden revelation caused me a heart attack and died on the spot. Sitting in front of the wailing son and furious mother, I can finally see through the whole plot. The three of them really worked hard for 40 long years. Now that I had seen through the drama, didn't agree with Betty. She pointed at me and scolded me. Ben, did you not hear me or not? I am warning you, if you don't accept John as your son today, then we don't have to continue. Betty lifted her head. Her tear-reddened eyes were pitifully appealing. Had it been in my past life, I would surely have agreed to everything out of pity. How much of a fool I was. Now though, I replied with a smile, okay. She rolled her eyes at me and let out a sigh of relief. Wouldn't it have been better if you had agreed earlier? You made me waste so much energy arguing with you. I casually shrugged my shoulders. Then let's just break up. Let's divorce. Betty was taken aback, her mouth wide open as she stared at me in disbelief. She was used to me giving in to her all orders. This was difficult for her to digest. Ben, are you serious? I nodded, stating seriously, yes, more real than a pearl. Betty scrutinized me. Seeing my calm expression, she instantly became upset. She wiped her tears and held John in her arms to comfort him while talking to me. Ben, take back your words now. I will pretend I didn't hear you. If you dare bring up divorce again, you won't have the chance anymore. Even if you kneel before me and plead, it won't work. I laughed at her confidence and was about to retort when the doorbell rang. Betty shot me a glance, cradling the child as she went to open the door. Betty. Paul stood outside the door, grinning as he called her name. Paul? Betty's eyes lit up instantly. She asked in surprise, why are you here? Hearing the chatting at the door, I got up and moved closer, crossing my arms as I observed all her reactions. In the past life, the day she brought John home, she invited a group of friends over. The goal was to help John integrate into her daily life as soon as possible. However, Betty's current reaction looks different, as if she is surprised. Struck me that was she also reborn. As this thought exploded in my brain, I started scrutinizing even more. Betty, congratulations on becoming a mother. Congratulations. This little one is so cute, crying with his face full of snot bubbles. A few mutual friends poked their heads out from behind Paul, each offering their congratulations with wide smiles. Betty, what's going on? Didn't you invite us to see John? Did you forget? Why is this child crying like this? Paul tenderly wiped away the tears on John's face. John gazed at him intensely, pouting his little mouth and reaching out his tiny hand towards him. Daddy hugged John. Paul was stunned when he heard the word, Daddy. Immediately turning to look at me. Oh, this little one has mistaken the wrong person for his father. Your dad is that handsome guy behind, who is looking at you. He must be heartbroken now, said a friend while pointing at me. Betty awkwardly smiled, glanced at me, and attempted to smooth over the situation. The child is still young, and it's normal for him to mistake people. Kids say the darndest things. I watched it all unfold, not saying a word. However, I couldn't help but sneer inwardly. I knew the truth of the matter. John, who was just 5 years old, at an age when he took adults' words as truth. Among the friends who were present, more than one was a man, but he only called Paul Dad. They treated me like a fool throughout my past life. It seemed that Betty and Paul had often met secretly, and the child was used to calling Betty Mom and Paul Dad. The room was filled with an awkward silence for a bit. Giving me a warning glance, Betty welcomed her friends into the living room. She then habitually ordered me to serve water and make coffee for them all. I just shot her a look, not budging. When everyone invited her to join them on the couch, she clenched her teeth and shot me a glare, but refrained from saying anything else. Everyone sat around John, presenting him with gifts and congratulatory envelopes. I sat alone on the side, seemingly engrossed in my phone, but in actuality, my mind was racing. I was still pondering over the question of rebirth. I was reborn, did Betty too? Looking at the undisguised affectionate gaze that Betty gave to Paul, I was certain that she must have been reborn. I remember, on this day in the past life, she kept a notable distance from Paul, avoiding any suspicions, making their mutual friends think that there was some sort of disagreement between the two. Moreover, in her previous life, during her later stage of illness, there was an outbreak of a deadly virus. The pandemic trapped Paul, who was overseas and couldn't return. Betty died without seeing him one last time. Is that why, when they met again, she stared at him so unabashedly and intensely? The rebirth has given me a chance to review my past life and many mysteries. Like, if Betty loved Paul so much, why did she not agree to divorce? And why did Paul not adopt John, but instead sent him to an orphanage? Come over with me? Betty approached me while I was lost in my thoughts. Taking a glance at her hand that was tightly gripping my clothes, I followed with pursed lips. Seeing that I didn't object to her in front of our friends, she was relieved. But this act of hers made me repulse her and irritated me further. I impatiently shook off her hand as soon as we entered the kitchen. Betty clicked her tongue and snapped at me. What are you trying to do, Ben? Are you trying to embarrass me in front of our friends on purpose? Is it because John accidentally called Paul Dad earlier? Do you have to be so petty? I put away my phone, looked at her, and answered decisively, as if, remembering my past life. On this day, my friends had dinner at my place and stayed until late at night. All the time I was serving them. But this time, because I had a cold expression the entire time, our friends noticed something was off and found excuses to leave. The little boy, John, hid beside the sofa, peeking at me with his big, timid eyes. I noticed him from the corner of my eye, ignored him, and went back to my phone. Betty sent off her friends and saw this. She immediately protected him in her arms, glaring at me. Ben, have you lost your mind? Bullying a child at your age. Who's the one who lost the mind? I'm sitting far from him. How am I bullying him? With telepathy. Betty was choked when she heard. With a stormy expression, she carried John, turned, and walked upstairs. The door was slammed shut by her. Even sitting by the dining table downstairs, I could hear turbulent anger. This time around, it had zero effect on me. It would be a joke if she thought that I'd take a step back to placate her, just like in my past life. Dream on. This was all that could be said. Ever since I learned that Betty had also been reborn, I become cautious. If I recollect correctly, the day after John was brought home, Betty secured a huge contract, giving the company's profits a significant boost, and her net worth skyrocketed. After receiving the project's dividends, she immediately used the money to buy an entire pedestrian street as a gift for John and bought a globally limited edition sports car for Paul. But she didn't bother to buy anything for me. She didn't spend a dime on me. What's more, I learned about this from a friend several years later. When I asked her about why she spent so much on Paul and John, all she said were excuses. She explained, saying, "It was thanks to Paul's influence that we were able to get that project. So it's only just to spend money on him as a form of compensation." But buying a pedestrian street for John requires no further explanation. Since he has come to our family, He should not lack anything that other children have. I was very upset at the time, but still comforted myself. What Betty said is correct. Everything in the house is decided by her. Looking back now, I realized she was just taking advantage of my kindness, treating everything as if it revolved around her. Although I comforted myself but knew very well that this order was sent by my father and had nothing to do with Paul. It was my father's way of compensating me. He abandoned us when I was young, and my relationship with him had been like oil and water. He dared not appear in front of me and could only help me from behind the scenes. But I was unaware of this fact back then and learned about it in my later years. However, I suspect that Betty never knew that the owner of the Carlson Group was my father, which was why she could lie so openly. This time, I won't let this family of 3 bully me again, as I decided to retaliate against them. I made a series of calls, then picked up my car keys and left. Heading towards the cafe in my memory, I was going to meet someone with whom I hadn't been in touch for a long time. This was someone who could help me turn the situation around. When I reached the cafe, that person was already sitting by the window. Upon seeing me, Lizzie Grant raised her coffee cup to gesture at me. After parking the car, I took several deep breaths to calm down before entering the door to the cafe. The bell on the door rang in response, and the gentle sunlight poured through the crack in the door, falling on Lizzie's side face. The air was filled with the scent of freshly ground coffee, and the melodious and romantic music made one even more intoxicated. Such a peaceful and comfortable atmosphere instantly put me at ease. We sat silently for a few minutes until I broke it. Has your habit never changed? You still like to come to this coffee shop, a place you used to pass by often when going to school. Aren't you avoiding me? Why did you suddenly think to get in touch? Lizzie answered with a question, pushing a cup of coffee with milk towards me while looking into my eyes. I picked up the coffee cup and took a sip. It tasted just like it did when we were young, and the awkward atmosphere alleviated somewhat. I want you to help me check the personal information of Paul Zander. The more detailed, the better. I spilled everything about why I wanted to look into him. Lizzie leaned against the couch, quietly listening to my narrative. Not until I finished after a long time did she speak. I can help you, but what's in it for me? Lizzie is my childhood friend. We used to spend every day together when we were young, and she developed feelings for me. But I didn't feel the same for her. Even after refusing her several times, she would still stick to me, leaving me exasperated. It was after my mother passed away that I moved away from the old house and deliberately cut contact with her. We hadn't been in touch for many years. Later, her career took off. I bumped into her several times at negotiation tables when discussing business with Betty, but neither of us was interested in catching up with the old times. Yet, every time her gaze would wander over me. When I looked over, she would naturally turn away. I knew she hadn't moved on. I crossed my hands, calmly looking into her eyes. What do you want? She quirked her eyebrow. Anything? I nodded. As long as I can afford it. Lizzie's gaze was bright, and with a faint smile, she said, You can afford it. I'll take care of your matters first. And when everything is settled, I'll ask you for my remuneration. What she said was somewhat ambiguous. Even though I felt a bit uncertain, I was stuck in a situation that didn't offer me many solutions. I hadn't been working for many years, didn't have much savings, and had no network of connections. Lizzie was the only person I could think of at such a time who could help me. Bidding farewell to Lizzie, I drove straight to the company assuming that Betty might be home with the kid, but also suspected I might run into her at the office. Standing at the door of her office, passionate gasps could be heard. It wasn't hard to know what was happening inside. Her assistant hid in the corner with blushing cheeks, pretending to be busy. She was doing her best to behave normally to pretend that everything was as usual, but her efforts were wasted on me. I knowingly waited quietly for the door to open. About half an hour later, the gasping finally subsided. Betty, looking glowing with radiance, opened the door. Anyone with the right eyes would know what had happened inside just by looking at her blush. Upon seeing me, she got nervous. Ben, Why are you here at the office? Seeing that I was calm, she seemed to have realized something. Changing her tone and her face, she asked, You knew I wasn't home, and you know about my schedule. Did you ask about my schedule? Are you trying to spy on me? Ben, why are you so stubborn? What do you want to do? It's pathetic. Nonchalantly, I glanced at Paul standing by her side, who also had a postcoital glow, but didn't answer her right away. Giving her a look, I calmly spoke. Betty, you've got food stuck on your teeth. Didn't he lick it off for you just now? Betty's face drastically changed, and she hurriedly covered her mouth and raced towards the restroom. Paul glared at me, then followed her. Seeing them go out one after the other, I managed to escape unscathed. Inside her office, after some research, I found the contact details of my father's assistant. Taking a picture of it, I stepped out, closing the door behind me. My purpose of visiting the office was achieved. Proceeding to the next steps of my plan, I intended to leave, however. Ben, stop right there. Betty stormed back. Anticipating her next move, I tightly gripped her wrist, throwing her hand off with force, warning, If you dare to lay a hand on me again, I won't hold back. She lost her balance and took a few steps back, with Paul catching her into his arms accurately. Both of them glared at me with wrathful eyes, reminiscent of two vexing venomous snakes. We were at a stalemate. There was an awkward tension that was broken when Betty's assistant came over to deliver the phone to her. Forcing herself to calm down before speaking on the phone, she gave a warning look. Receiving the phone, Betty instantly beamed. How are you, Assistant Norman? Noticing my gaze, she covered her phone and returned to her office. As I heard the name she'd called, I understood what was going on. Assistant Norman was the right-hand man of my father. The call made it clear that things in this life were still happening as they did in the past life. Betty had once again gained a project that would elevate her social status. This was a piece of good news for her, but a bad one for me. Racking my brain for countermeasures, I left the company. Calculating the time, Betty's call might have ended. I fetched a business card from my card holder and dialed a number. The call soon went through. Afraid that Assistant Norman would hang up, suspecting spam, I introduced myself. However, the introduction merely said that I was an old acquaintance of old Mr. Carlson. After mentioning the purpose of the call, there was a brief pause on the other end. Soon, he replied with a meeting place, asking me to come promptly. This filled me with energy. From the respectful tone of Assistant Norman, it was clear that he was aware of my identity. Ending the call, I headed to the meeting place. It was so serene that the setting mesmerized me. There was a small bridge over running water, pavilions, towers, and a backdrop of vintage buildings. This is a precise one-to-one restoration of a classical garden. I mockingly sighed. Being rich makes one carefree. Assistant Norman stood at the door to welcome me and guide me through a winding path to a pavilion at the center of the lake. My gaze instantly fell upon the old man who stood with his back to me. As Assistant Norman announced my arrival, he stiffened up, turned around, and sat by the table. Could be seen that his hands were trembling. When he poured tea, it spilled out of the cup. He motioned Assistant Norman to withdraw, and only the two of us were left. He finally managed to call me and asked me to sit. The strain in his voice was obvious. Sitting across from him, I observed him openly. There was no need to hide now. He did not look like the crude and dull father in my memory. Indeed, wealth changes man. Stabilizing his shaking hand, he poured a cup of tea for me and gently said, Try this, Ben. It's tea from my latest collection. However, his call disgusted me. Don't call me that. I furrowed my brows in an instant, pushing the tea away with my hand. It hit the ground with a crisp sound. He lowered his eyes and let out a self-mocking laugh. I understand if you don't forgive me after all. After all, it was you who abandoned us for your mistress, and you took all the valuables. Do you know how we lived after you left? My mother died of prolonged illness when I was in high school because we couldn't afford medical treatment. I roared in fury, venting the resentment accumulated from my past and present life. I asked him, You have a new family. Why do you still appear before me? All my outbursts had almost no effect on him. He probably had much expected this. She took a lot of my wealth and ran away with a young man. He poured me another cup of tea and continued self-mockingly. I had a medical checkup recently. The doctor told me I won't be able to have any more children in my lifetime. His words added fuel to the fire within me, and I roared again. So that's why you suddenly remembered me? You didn't think of me until now? Now you think with a few warm words and pity will let me forget and forgive all you did to us all those years ago? Is it that simple? You think your little sweet talk will make me take care of you when you are old? Is that what you think? I sneered. Do you think you deserve it? His eyes were always downcast, old face was full of pain. I just felt ridiculous. Cheaters don't deserve a good ending. I didn't feel like dredging up the past with him any longer and directly came to the point. I have no plans to take over Betty's company. You don't have to give her the project. No need to help her anymore. He nodded and refilled the cup in front of me. Then I will give the project to that girl Lizzie. You had people follow me. I suddenly stood up, staring into his eyes. There was a chilling aura around me. Ben, don't be angry. I just wanted to see if you were doing well or not. My entire estate will be yours in the future. You'll have full control over it. I don't want it. I threw the words and left angrily, driving aimlessly around the city. Eventually, returning home to face another battle. Betty was at the dining table feeding John. Seeing me come in, the softness on her face instantly hardened, replaced by bitterness. "Humph, you sure know how to come back just in time for meals," she snapped. Instead of responding, I headed straight into the kitchen to make myself some noodles. After dinner, she received another call from Assistant Norman. Finishing the call in an obsequious manner, she handed John to me and was about to leave saying, "I need to run some urgent errands, Ben. You better take good care of John." Without bothering to answer her, I continued slowly eating my noodles. Thinking I had agreed, she grabbed her bag and left the house. After leisurely finishing my meal, I took John back to the orphanage. I had no inclination or obligation towards taking care of a child that was born out of cheating on me. The head of the orphanage was startled upon seeing John back. His look of askance was clear, but I turned around and left before he could respond. I wasn't a saint who would take care of other people's kids. Leaving the orphanage, I met Lizzie and went to the Bureau of Negotiations. When Betty saw me there, her eyes shot cold blades toward me. "Ben, what are you doing here?" Obviously out of her expectation to see me there. Behind me, Lizzie walked in and politely called my father Uncle Carlson. Betty's expression darkened. Her eyes were faintly concealed with confusion. "Ben, how come you and Lizzie are together? Where is my son?" "I sent him to the orphanage," I replied, calm as can be, settling down in my seat. Just when Betty was about to demand further explanation, my father sent a sharp look towards her to shut her up. With a cool voice, Assistant Norman said, "If President Smith is busy, she may leave." Although the words were polite, the tone was like an eviction order. Flustered, Betty had no choice but to sit back down, but her gaze constantly moved over Lizzie and me. Throughout the ordeal, Lizzie had a smirk on her face and intentionally acted intimate with me. Needless to say, she was trying to provoke Betty, and I chose not to play ignorant. Lizzie and Betty were business rivals. Their businesses overlapped and often led to conflicts. Tonight's meeting intended to publicly announce that the Carlson Corporation's project would change hands to Lizzie Grant's company. Furious to the point that her face turned red, Betty dared not lash out. Only when the meeting ended did she find the chance to corner Assistant Norman for an explanation. He glanced at me out of habit, noticing I had no intention of interrupting. He carefully chose his words before responding. "It was Mr. Carlson's decision. President Smith should understand that I am merely an employee. I dare not guess the boss's intentions. I only fulfill my duties." Suffering a loss of several billion, Betty dropped all pretenses. She stormed off in anger. As she walked past me, she hissed, "Worthless! Mr. Carlson is aware that today is your birthday. This is your birthday present." Seeing Betty standing beside me, Assistant Norman deliberately opened the gift box, revealing a limited black card. Seeing the card and hearing his words, Betty instantly fell silent. Her eyes locked onto the black card, her gaze filled with greed. Lizzie pulled out a limited edition watch from her bag and handed it to me. "This is my gift for you." I thanked her, and as was about to take it, she held it high and looked at me softly, saying, "Let me put it on for you." Betty stood there with a black face looking at our interaction. I cast a glance at her before stretching out my arm with a smile, saying, "Thank you, Miss Grant." The simple and generous watch was particularly eye-catching. It wasn't ostentatious but could indicate it was expensive. Assistant Norman complimented Lizzie at the right time, saying, "Miss Grant has a good eye." Lizzie sweetly replied, "That fits well with Mr. Carlson's persona." As we all chimed in and had fun, Betty was left fuming, huffing, and puffing alone. Several times she tried to speak up, but every time she was interrupted by Assistant Norman. She held herself back each time. Finally, unable to repress it anymore, she said in a cold voice, "Ben, you," just as she started speaking, was interrupted. "What is everyone talking about?" It was my father who walked over. Seeing him, Betty had to swallow her words once again. She was so frustrated that her face flushed red. Lizzie, who was enjoying the show, couldn't help but snicker out loud. She teased, saying, "President Smith, you don't look too well. Do you need me to call an ambulance for you?" Betty gritted her teeth, shooting a vicious glare at Lizzie. Before things could turn ugly, I bid farewell to my father and swiftly exited. As I descended the stairs, I realized that Betty had not left but had been waiting for me. Lizzie, who followed me, upon seeing her, intentionally moved closer and whispered in my ear, "Want to test whether or not your wife truly cares about you?" Her warm breath brushed against my ear, making me feel uncomfortable, and I sidestepped, saying dismissively, "Childish." Seeing my reaction, Lizzie sighed heavily in a hushed tone. "Are you avoiding me? Seeing me as some kind of monster, perhaps? Also, do you still want to hear information about Paul or not?" Her voice took on a seductive edge, and I found myself instinctively looking at her. "You found something?" Betty, seeing me ignore her, walked over in my direction. Her eyes were deep as if they hid raging flames within. "Ben, come with me." She left no room for debate in her tone. I silently met her gaze. "And if I refuse? Then don't blame me for being rude. You dared to contact Chairman Carlson behind my back. He even remembers your birthday and gifted you the black card. Come on, hand it over." She clenched her teeth in anger, stretching her hand up towards me. I was too lazy to explain, and simply replied, "Lizzie gave me a birthday present." I considered the black card as a return gift and gave it to her, to show the authenticity of the words. Lizzie played with the black card in her hand with a smirk which was just too infuriating. In fact, I had guessed Betty would set her sights on the black card and brazenly ask me to hand it over to her. And so, proactively, I left the card with Lizzie, planning to return it to my father when the time was right. "Ben, you?" Betty stared at me incredulously, seemingly wishing to chop me into pieces. "Can't you figure out who your wife is? You and Lizzie are this intimate. Have you been having an affair behind my back? Watch your filthy mouth. You think everyone's as horrible as you." My temper flared up, and my words took a sharp turn. Betty tried to slap me when her argument fell short. Before the hand could fall on me, Lizzie blocked it, not giving Betty any chance. Betty, who was even more agitated because she failed to slap me, wanted to say something. At this moment, a call from Paul came. As soon as Betty picked it up, John's earth-shattering sobs could be heard through the phone. "Little Johnny, don't cry." Betty's voice instantly turned soft, full of motherly affection. Her eyes reddened. Paul on the other side choked and said, "Betty, you need to come quickly." After Ben abandoned John in the orphanage, he nearly cried himself breathless. How could he do this? How could he be so cruel? "After all, John, he's your—" Before he could finish, I cut in. "Your what? Why don't you finish? Get lost. I'll settle the scores with you later." Betty roared at me and then tried to soothe the father and son on the other end of the phone in a hoarse voice. "Mummy's coming soon. Wait for me, little Johnny. Wait with Daddy. Okay?" I snorted. "Calling Paul Daddy now? No pretense anymore." Betty looked uncomfortable, trying to cover up, said, "I don't understand what you're talking about." Then she hurriedly drove away. Lizzie patted me on my shoulder, commenting sarcastically, "What's the matter? Can't bear to see her leave." I brushed her hand aside and expressionlessly said, "You're overthinking." We left the Bureau of Negotiations and I drove Lizzie home. On the way, to avoid any conversation with her, I turned on the radio. The radio was broadcasting a show on parenting, causing me to frown and switch channels. The next channel turned out to be a love advisory station. "Switch it off. If you don't want to talk, then don't," Lizzie said, leaning against the car door. Her remark made the atmosphere even more awkward. We drove to her villa district. As she was leaving, she asked, "You and Betty, you find there's something wrong between us, don't you?" I scoffed. "It's nothing strange. She got pregnant behind my back with the one you were investigating for me. When I understand everything that I'm unclear about right now, I will divorce her. She got pregnant by someone else. You must feel terrible," Lizzie reluctantly said after a pause. "Yes, I wholeheartedly invested in our marriage for over a decade, and this is where it led me." I shifted the conversation. "So, how is your investigation going, Boss Grant?" I hadn't asked Betty for a divorce because I had my suspicions about the games she'd been playing behind my back with Paul. In my past life, Betty fascinated me so much that I endured everything unknowingly. However, now with a chance to start anew, I would clear all obstacles that might bring trouble in the future. Paul is one of the lurking dangers. I must understand his intentions to set my mind at ease. Give me a couple more days. Paul has been living abroad. I have already asked a friend overseas to investigate. All right, thank you. It was already 10 o'clock at night when I reached home, assuming everyone should be asleep. As soon as I stepped through the door, I saw the family of 3 sitting on the couch waiting for me. John was playing with a model plane sitting on the carpet. I took a closer look and immediately snatched it from him, scaring John into crying with a pout. "Ben, are you out of your mind? If you're sick, see a doctor. It's just an old broken toy plane. Do you have to snatch it from a child?" Betty held him up tenderly, soothing him with soft words. "Ben, how could you treat a 5-year-old child like this?" Paul was also furious. I ignored them and inspected the model plane before saying angrily, "Say whatever you want, if you want to make him happy, buy toys. But don't lecture me like a good person while taking my things without asking. I find it disgusting. The plane was a birthday gift from my mother when I was a kid. It was hard enough for her to work and provide for me. She scrimped and saved for a long time to buy gifts for me, sacrificing her meals and drinks. The plane is usually placed in an acrylic box. I didn't even want to touch it, and she had the gall to call it old. Fine, fine, fine. I will never touch your things again, okay?" Betty said with an impatient face. "Paul and I are going to travel abroad. The project fell through. He has some connections that he wants to introduce to me. We're leaving John with you. Take good care of him. If you dare to send him back to the orphanage, you will know what happens. Ben, John is a good kid. Don't be so irresponsible and do things like you did anymore," said Paul, preaching to me. I glanced at the two of them indifferently, taking out a wet wipe to carefully clean the model plane. "Ben, I'm talking to you. Are you deaf?" Betty Smith raised her voice sharply, seeing my attitude. After the contract was signed in the past life with Carlson's, Betty left the country with Paul. At that time, she said, "Carlson Corporation's supply chain is an old overseas factory. I need to go and inspect it on site." Then, finding an excuse to let Paul accompany her, she added, "Paul should also return to his job overseas, so I will go with him by the way." Her words didn't raise the slightest suspicion at that time, and I readily agreed to take care of John. But this time won't happen. There's no chance I will stand it. I am not good with kids. If you insist on going abroad, you should take him with you. Otherwise, I might send him back to the orphanage." Betty suddenly scowled at me, but I didn't give her a chance to vent her anger. Instead, went straight back to my bedroom on the 2nd floor. The next day, while Betty was out, I searched through every corner of the house but found nothing unusual. In the evening, Lizzie called me, informing me that she had some news. Following the address she provided, I arrived just in time to see Paul in an intimate embrace with a burly foreign woman. I was taken aback and quickly hid the car under the shade of the trees. After waiting for some time, Lizzie knocked on my car window, and I let her in. "Did you see that fat woman? She is Paul's wife. Her father is an obscure foreign painter who has a high status. Paul's status overseas is way higher than yours. Although we were not close to, I learned from Betty about Paul's life in general in our past lives. Lizzie told me that Paul's paintings had impressed his father-in-law. I was wondering, he wasn't an art student, just an ordinary office worker. How could it be that one single painting got him into the good graces of such a prominent figure? What painting? Do you have a picture of it?" I asked, puzzled. Lizzie showed me a photo. I was immediately shocked. "Isn't this the one I drew casually in my free time?" Everything became crystal clear. Betty must have known everything about Paul. She had been secretly taking my paintings to him. That's why he mingled in the foreign niche genre circles. He was afraid I would discover that he had been plagiarizing my work. But what Betty didn't know was that each of my paintings had her name's abbreviation, hidden within the custom-made font that I specially bought. This gave me a good reason to ask for a divorce. Since she couldn't bring herself to request a divorce, then I would provide her the final assistance. Well, everything is clear now. When will you divorce Betty? Lizzie playfully lifted my chin. Don't forget what you promised me. You said you would accept my request. I turned my head to dodge, understanding her meaning. Once I've sorted out this matter, I will divorce her. I gave her a straight answer. From that day on, I started keeping an eye on Betty's daily routine. The few days when she and Paul traveled abroad, I followed them but on a different plane. Lizzie provided me with Paul's address abroad and the address of his painting studio. She also transferred $100,000 to me. After tailing them for 2 days, I understood that nothing could be found out like this. Then I hired a private detective at a high price. Within a couple of days, they captured some crucial high-definition photos. Looking at Betty and Paul making out, playing hide-and-seek under the lamp on the bed he shared with his foreign wife. I couldn't help but exclaim, "Money is a wonderful thing." After obtaining the evidence, I hailed a taxi to the Artists' Union. There, an appreciation event was being held, and Paul stood in the spotlight, talking eloquently about the creative concepts behind each of his paintings. Betty sat in the front row, looking at him with a gaze full of admiration. I sat in the last row, quietly listening to Paul making up stories, and couldn't help but laugh out loud. My laughter startled everyone, and they turned around to look at me with unhappy faces. Betty was very intrigued when she realized it was me. She hurriedly came over and pulled me out to leave. "Ben, you come out with me first and I will explain to you," she said. "What is there to explain?" I broke free from her and looked around at the paintings on the wall. I then asked loudly, "Explain how the paintings I drew ended up on the walls of this foreign exhibition as Paul's?" For everyone to understand, I deliberately spoke loudly in their language. Betty desperately tried to cover my mouth, but she wasn't tall enough, and I didn't cooperate. After I said that, everyone gasped and looked at the elderly man sitting in the middle of the front row. Paul also looked at the old man. He feared that his act might be blown up. He got up and burst out, "Ben, stop slandering me. I painted every single one of these." "Did you?" I walked over and pointed at one of them. "Since you want to clear your name, I won't make you draw a new one. Instead, just sign your name just like you did on the paintings on this one right here. What do you think, sir?" To provoke the audience, I asked the old man. I knew that the special font was exclusive to me and Paul wouldn't be able to use it and sign his name like the one on the painting. Besides, those were Betty's initials in special font which were difficult to copy. This was a real test for an idler like Paul who got everything without making any effort. All the onlookers' eyes were fixed on the scene. The old man struck his cane on the ground and made the final decision. "Go ahead and sign it." Betty was standing in the back. Her face was already frighteningly pale. Paul's eyes flickered, picked up a pen, and repeatedly signed on the paper several times to get the correct one before ultimately throwing the pen down in despair and yelling, "Don't force me. Don't force me. These drawings are my creations. I created them. They are my work." I scoffed, picked up the pen, and smoothly signed exactly the way it was on the paintings. Everyone suddenly understood at that moment. Paul was just a plagiarist. The young painters who had always looked down on him but were mindful of the old man finally began to vent their grievances when they saw him trip. The old man, having suffered humiliation, wanted to blame me. Paul's wife came up to me and grabbed my collar. Betty, seeing that I was about to be beaten, suddenly looked stunned. All three were blaming me. Even the young painters who held a grudge against Paul didn't come forward to help me. In this commotion, Lizzie had entered the venue at some point in time and walked in with her high heels. She saw the scene and said, "If I'm not mistaken, isn't this also a society ruled by law? Getting exposed for plagiarism. then angrily resorting to bullying. Is this the right way? She uttered more words that were provocating people there to get Paul, his wife, and her father caught as accomplices. Seeing Lizzie, the only one who wanted to help me out of the mob, I felt like crying. She gave me a reassuring look and continued, "If you're not interested in the plagiarism, then take a look at these." She flicked her wrist and papers fluttered to the ground. People picked them up and collectively gasped. Their gaze ambiguously lingered between Betty and Paul. "Don't look. Stop looking at me." Betty covered her face with her hands and cried out with a voice torn by agony, but it was to no avail. Someone whistled lewdly at her. "Senior, I believe you aren't aware of this matter. Your son-in-law, behind your daughter's back, has rekindled his romance with his first love. And all this happened on your daughter's marital bed." Lizzie paused for a moment, letting the old man take in new information, then added, "Oh yes, they also have a child named John Smith. He is already 5 years old this year." The name John shows how much the parents must love each other. After Paul's wife learned about his cheating and love child, he was nearly beaten to death by her right there in front of all the people. Amid the chaos, I protected Lizzie and retreated. The rest was the battle for the painters and the family to settle. Betty saw us leaving and begged me in tears to save her, to take her away. I didn't even spare her a glance. That very night, I received a call from the hospital. Lizzie accompanied me to the hospital. There, Betty, with her face swollen like a pig, was lying on the hospital bed with an 4 drip being administered to her. Upon seeing me, she struggled to get up, only to be pushed back down by the nurse. She extended her hand towards me, her speech slurry from crying. "Ben, listen to me, there's nothing between me and Paul. He seduced me." Looking down at her with contempt, I said, "He seduced you? What's so special about you that anyone would seduce you? Get a good look at how you look right now. It's disgusting. Ben, you can't say that about me. You used to love me the most. Have you forgotten?" It was fine until she brought it up, and the mention of it just stirred up my anger. I slammed a divorce agreement on her face and said vindicatively, "Betty, sign it. I can let go of the fact that you stole my paintings, as long as you sign this divorce agreement today. Otherwise, be ready to go to jail." Betty cried bitterly, shaking her head frantically. "There's one more thing I think you should know. The Carlson Group is my father's company. I am informing you with certainty today, Betty, from now on you won't get a single project. Your company will soon lose its standing in the industry. You better prepare for bankruptcy." With that, regardless of Betty's reaction, I resolutely left with Lizzie. A month after returning to our country, Betty returned from abroad. John was not by her side. I heard from Lizzie that Betty had sent the child back to the orphanage. The director of the orphanage initially thought John could lead a good life, but seeing Betty losing her enthusiasm in just a few days, he was so annoyed that he chased her out of the orphanage with a broom. He said he never wanted to see her again. I just took it as a joke. The first thing Betty did when she got home was kneel before me, desperately apologizing and swearing, just to get another chance. I listened to all the excuses and arguments, remaining silent. When I had enough, took out my phone to call the police. Seeing that I was about to call the police, Betty got scared, snatched my phone away, and hung up. She was utterly desperate and compromised for divorce for her freedom. The day I received the divorce certificate was a clear and sunny day. After living 2 lifetimes, for the first time, I felt like life was so marvelous. That day Lizzie was waiting for me outside the court. Seeing me walking out, she honked at me from her car. "Don't rush me. I'm coming." I put away the divorce certificate, smiling as I ran towards her. The car started, and Betty in the rearview mirror gradually grew blurrier. I shifted my gaze back, smiling at Lizzie. "Boss Grant, please guide me throughout the rest of my life.